everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this video I will be analyzing what is known as the moral compass, conscience, which is a result of the way intelligence develops itself according to the intelligence, whether it be of emotional nature or logical nature. And in the development of a moral compass, we then see that an individual's behavior towards others is as a result of which section of their conscience developed more than another. You could say if an individual developed more emotionally, they may have a possibility at gaining greater connective ability just as much as they have the ability to destroy those connections based on emotional impulse. Where now we might see that the individuals with logical intelligence may struggle to create a emotional connection due to the fact that they are in a logical state. You begin to see different people in the world all of a sudden. And in this moral compass is essentially where we find ourselves as people to this day. In the idea of the psychoanalysis of the moral compass, which I will now indue you into, I will be using a current model of the societal structure in order to be able to draw out your moral compass, in order to be able to identify if you are of an emotional intelligence nature, which stems from a more unstable nature because of its impulsiveness, or you could stem from the logical perspective where you now have an introvert type experience, a lesser ability to be as impulsive, but in this perspective you have what is known as serums, which give you the ability to become more impulsive. From one, you can become the other, but from the other, you cannot necessarily just be that one. And in human development, known as personal growth, in the idea of developing the moral conscience, the moral compass of individuals, we must grow our ability to gain perspective, to see things from a greater perspective, not just from the perspective of our own greeds and needs, but of the needs of others. Now, in the idea, in essence, behind the moral compass, pursuing to seek creating a movement towards bettering the lives of others, we may see a beauty as a people. We may begin to see an agreement as a people to the betterment of those we seek to empower. At which particular point we then see the nature at which we seek to empower, which if we seek to empower of a minority group, which now if I may use the trans folk, which in my analysis, if I may speak in a peaceful coming, I speak not of hate in this particular manner, I speak of actual understanding in the notion that I will present going forward. And I hope this helps you as an individual if you happen to be dealing with transgenderism, whether you are fully transitioned are in transition or have begun the idealization into the transition process. Because regardless of whether you have or haven't, you are still you, which means you are a self. And in order to accept the self, we have to dive into what makes the self. What are you created from as an individual? Well, you could say you are created from your parents. And the idea of the acceptance one individual might feel from their parents, one might now see the form of love that they would accept or feel from their parents, creating their orientation. In the beginning process of the orientation itself, you would then see how the child learns to perceive love in the eyes that it will grow towards in its orientation, which now becomes its sexual orientation. And in the patterns, it learns to recognize love within its parental figure, whichever sex or sexes that the child learns to perceive affection or love from will then result in that child ultimately learning what is known as the form of love that they feel love from, whether it be male, female. In the arising beyond that, we then see the complex arise as non-binary, which is, you could argue, not speaking in hate, I'm trying to speak in a more peaceful understanding, because the ultimate truth behind it is regarding self-acceptance, which in the analysis of trying to speak in a peaceful nature without causing a trigger point, but simply of a place where you may feel in a safe space that does cause you to experience a mild rewiring of your nervous system, if you wish, where you may now gain a logical perspective. If an individual self, also known as yourself, learn how to perceive love based on the parental nature that which you can learn to receive love from, I would argue that as a non-binary person, you might have felt like neither of your parents loved you, which is in itself rather quite sad. I'm sorry you had to go through that. But going forward, do you now see that in your non-identifying with either of wanting a partner in either male or female, you still have a sexual proclivity, which means at the fundamental value of your sexual proclivity, you still see yourself as a human being, which if you have stopped in your sexual proclivity, you would then see yourself as an alienation of society. If you do not have a choice into reproduction, then you are actively creating a higher path for yourself, a form of priesthood, you could say, where you are no longer choosing to proceed in the reproductionary evolution of humankind, but you are seeking to evolve the pathology of humankind, the mental state of humankind. And in the peaceful understanding of this complex, where you may see yourself slightly higher due to the fact that you are not bound to the binary of the two sexes, you now have a, you could say, slight sociopathy, because you do not attach yourself to the non-binary. You are non-binary at that point. You do not attach yourself to either female or male in your partner selection, but you would find rather quickly, all of a sudden you do find you do enjoy to have fun. And in that having fun is where you find the love, because this is where you fundamentally were stunted. You just didn't get to experience fun growing up. And you're actively discovering yourself, having fun, living your life to the best of your abilities based on what you were given. But now we dive into the idea behind the trans, which, going back to the idea prior, that in the orientation of how you learn to perceive love from a parental figure as a self, as you develop from very young, in the stages of the relationships of your life, you will also see that in the relationships you have in those eras and stages of life, you have separate emotions towards those parental figures, which in itself create different stimulus to your own experience as a child. And in understanding that individual experience, you might feel a certain state of confusion, because you have one parent all of a sudden that might not necessarily be happy or as loving towards you, and the one parent you normally feel love from is all of a sudden angry towards you. This is known as what creates teenage years. As you develop more and more and more in your own strength and in your own hormones, what you end up seeing is that all of a sudden you become a competition. Pardon the break in that I had a trouble speaking that word. But in the competition between which initial offspring the sex of that offspring is, you might see now that in similar or normal sex partners, you would see that in male and female relationships, which can only result an offspring from, you would see that in this particular notion, the sex of the offspring now creates a competition towards the sex of the previous parent that this offspring is of same sex of, which now means there is a hierarchy in a battle, which means based on, if imagine a son and father, as the son grows up, if a father isn't necessarily as loving to the woman because he himself is now replaced by a son, a new man in the woman's life, he might pull back, causing the woman to push more towards the son. But in your teenage years, you might feel in your development, you all of a sudden push the woman back and she pushes back to the father. And then as you enter young adulthood, once again, the father might push the mother back towards you as the son, on and on and on. And this cycle creates the experience known as the stages of evolution of the orientation of the experience of Earth. In this particular orientation on Earth, in this particular dimension, we see that we obey fundamental laws, which are the universal laws, the laws of the what makes what is and what is, and what is not, what is not. going back into the parental structure of things, now that you see the pattern at which you may experience eras or stages as an individual based on your parental patterns, which the parents of yourself as an individual, you might now perceive that when your father or your mother is not happy with your father, or if you're, as a daughter, if your father is not happy with your mother, he might be happy with you as a daughter. And this creates essentially the hierarchy of generations. The further back we dive into this analysis, we then see the further and further we have come into the essential perversion of the mind, which now in our present day and age, we see the implication of more and more perversions, which become more and more private or widely available and are no longer privatized. They are more easily accessible. And the more we include this experience now inducing drugs and identification through different eras of existence based on parental love and all of these other factors, you gain this major concoction, which is now you as the offspring. And you might say, well, I'm extremely confused at that point. And I would say, yeah, I would be too if I was you. But now we get to the point where we can see a transition. Now, in understanding that it might be as a result of coping with your parents that you are choosing to want to self-harm, to no longer identify with either of them made you. Because in the self-acceptance, and I speak this as peacefully coming, in the idea of finding your self-acceptance, who do you love more in between both of your parents? Because ultimately, even if you did not experience what you would have wanted to feel as love from your parents, based on the experience you would have wanted to experience as a child, which parent did you naturally gravitate towards, regardless of how abusive they were towards you? Because I want you to become aware of this particular statement here and now. In the encouraging you to pursue, and I am being very careful as I say this, because this is a matter of life and death at this particular point. But in the encouragement that society not just has enforced in the ideology, that this possible moment in life either is or isn't you, the moment you have to accept regardless of the transition itself, is, are you who you are? Regardless of your transition, is that who you are? Inside, regardless of the body, is that who you are? Because if that is who you are, then you are a valued life, and we can give you life. But you have to accept that life is not easy. And in the idea, we are all free to live our lives. But I want you to be specifically aware of the notion that there's no going back. beyond this point, if you do not accept yourself, it could be life-ending. Now that you've accepted whether you have made the transition or have not, you can continue living in the path you saw yourself you were meant to live. And in understanding that, you need to let go of the anger, which has caused you not to feel love, not from others, but love towards yourself. Because this anger towards your parental figures is in essence what's stopping you from meeting the love of your life. It's not about what the body is. It's about what's on the inside that's stopping you from meeting the love of your life. And so with that notion, be who you are. It's as simple as that. But in the notion now that the Canadian parents have enforced the confusion which the government has popularized through the healthcare system based on the current societal model of capitalism regarding this particular treatment, you are actively creating an immense amount of problems in people's lives, which people like psychologists have to heal those people from, based on the values you are pulling away from the acceptance of the individual self. And in the notion based upon the previous video, I would argue that the current model of societal structures we are living within Canada is not currently up to its optimal form. We live a pretty damn good life in Canada, but it's still not up to its optimal form. And you might say, well, how can you say that? There's other places suffering far and far and far more. Which, as a feminist viewer, you might say now, absolutely. There have been women this whole time that have been suffering in other countries where they may not even experience education still to this day. And in the idea of the suffering of just the most oppressed place in the world known as Western civilization, apparently, we are creating a degenerated, dehumanized experience because we have warped or completely blinded ourselves in the act of acting upon emotional intelligence rather than logical intelligence. Based upon this analysis, you may see the depth at which the price of life and the weight of it not only bears its weight upon the individual self, but the individual that is giving them life at that particular point. And now when we see and understand just how painful the experience of the individual known as a transgender person is, may we please have a moment of peace, even if it may be for a mere second, just to say, that is a person, that is a live being, and they have a right to live just as any other person. And so in respect of that regards, people are people, orientations are orientations. The question now is, at which level do we accept a normal standard? Because all of a sudden, the more we create more and 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 more of these acceptance standards, well, you might as well just get grabbed by the beast at that point if you're just going to eat yourself up. Now, regarding the current societal structure, it's pretty damn good, but there's minor tweaks we can make to it to make it better. For one, taking the fundamental truth behind self-acceptance, known as the Holy Bible, which in itself is a paradox of sorts, which is the generation of yourself, your own moral compass, which is what every language is meant to represent, whether it be through a form of vocal language, art, and expression. But the moment you create a language or an expression, you now have to find a way to interpret the acceptance of it within yourself, which is in itself its own language, which, according to your own moral compass, you generate then your emotional or logical intelligence. At which rate is the logical and emotional intelligence taking over society? And at which rate is that particular personality also creating a negative experience to society in the idea that it thinks it is doing good? A paradox. Discovering what might be the self, a question. What might be the self? A question, which in the Bible, even as you might understand now, in the acceptance of self is the retraction of self, because you have to create a reflection. If in the Bible speaks of all-knowing acceptance, yet creates a notion of a disacceptance for certain orientations, then you would have to look at it from the perspective of, based on that orientation, the replication of this pattern is a human pattern. The problem in the self-acceptance is the question. It is not about the orientation, it's about the question. Once again, what is the self? Because if I look at myself just based on what my orientation is, I'm not truly looking at myself in the mirror. I'm just looking down here at that point, and my eyes are up here. The orientation of the individual, whether it be a mental or physical orientation, is according to the complex or the traumas experienced that result in the way you create your likes and dislikes, known as personality. And according to your personality, now you might find, just the same way the universe functions in its likes and dislikes, its ability to bind or not bind with other molecules to create matter, and its ability to create its likes and dislikes. The universe, which you are the universe experiencing itself in its greatest moment of self-acceptance, is the realization that you are simply yourself. You are the universe. You are the self. And you are experiencing yourself. And in that notion, you need to learn to accept the particular self, that which yourself were meant to live, thyself. Thank you.